This is the Work University Podcast, episode 47.
This is Work University, and I'm Annalisa Felix. This is where I interview people from various employment backgrounds and get the inside scoop on what their job is really like. If you're just getting into the workforce, or if you're curious about getting into something new, listen up.
Hi, today I am speaking with Adina Applebaum, who is an immigration lawyer in Virginia. Adina, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on this show. I'm really honored to be here.
So let's just dive in. What is an immigration lawyer, and get into some of your day-to-day, or somebody who wants to maybe get into this field?
Absolutely. Well, there's so many different kinds of immigration lawyers. I'll just start off saying it's known as one of the most complex areas of law after tax law. It's super complicated. There's a lot of specialty. So there's everything from like employment immigration to family-based immigration, humanitarian, like asylum refugee work. So I have worked my whole career in the last category: humanitarian, asylum refugee work, deportation defense, and I've worked specifically with immigrant adults and children who are detained by immigration customs enforcement and who are in the process of deportation going before immigration court. So it's a defensive posture of immigration law, but all cases actually going to immigration court are in that position. Just some people are detained, some are not.
So when you were going to law school, is this something that you knew you wanted to do? And tell me a little bit about the day-to-day.
Yeah. Well, I did go to law school to become an asylum lawyer. And so I did know somewhat I wanted to do that, but it took me a really long time to get to that realization. I really fought being a lawyer. I did not want to be a lawyer at all. I ended up doing refugee legal work abroad and realized, I had to be a lawyer in the US to do that in the US if I ever wanted to go back home. So that led me to law school. And in terms of the day-to-day, again, it really depends on what kind of immigration lawyer you are. If you're doing the kind that I've done, it's very fast-paced. It's, you can have many, many cases going very quickly, especially cases for people who are detained are super fast. For non-detained cases, they can take years. They can be really super slow because the immigration courts are so backlogged. So that's a big thing that can change the dynamic. But it can be going to immigration court, doing trials, putting in applications for people for, defenses to deportation, like asylum. For example, there's actually many different kinds, though. There can be petitions for people to get a green card through their family member. But the kind of immigration law I do day to day is actually called impact litigation. So it's focused on trying to improve the law for broad groups of immigrants. And so we bring cases that are appeals or cases in federal court, really outside the immigration court system, to try to get the law applied, because in the immigration court system, the law is often not applied, unfortunately. It's kind of, there's a couple sayings people say. People call it the wild, wild west of immigration court, because there's like no rules that apply. In a normal court, there's something called the rules of evidence that everybody has to follow to make sure that there's due process and all that. In immigration court, they just don't really apply, right? And it's a very adversarial system. And it's also called, unfortunately, this is true, traffic court with death penalty consequences, which I know is really heavy to hear, but that's really what it's like, because the courts are just so backlogged, they're so under-resourced, and it's like walking into traffic court, just one person after another. They often don't even say the person's name. They'll just read what's called their A number, which is like a couple of digits assigned to them, and just order deportation. It's crazy. And for someone who has a fear of returning to their home country, whether it's because of persecution or torture, that can mean death, right? So there's really serious consequences to it. So there's like the everyday paperwork aspect, but there's also the really big implications of the work. And then just to get back to what I do with impact litigation, it's going outside that whole system to like a real federal court, which can be filing an appeal to a circuit court. The circuit courts are the last level of court before the Supreme Court, right? And or it can be like bringing a class action. So it's really crazy. There's
Wow.
a lot that goes on in the immigration world.
I had no idea that, because I would assume that immigration lawyers, the law, applies there. And you're telling me that most often it does not. And so that blows my mind.
It should be, but the first 2 years of my career as an immigration lawyer was on the specific type of case I was bringing appeals on, because the law was really good from the Supreme Court, from the circuit courts. The immigration judges just weren't applying it. It was a complicated area. They didn't really understand it. They would get it wrong all the time. They wouldn't listen to the lawyers. Most people don't have lawyers. That's a really big problem too. That's something I want to highlight, because a lot of people don't know that in the criminal system, if you can't afford a lawyer, you get a public defender. In immigration court, you don't. So the vast majority of people, especially detained people, are what's called pro se, where they're representing themselves alone against a government-trained lawyer from the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And they may not speak English. They may not have a college degree or have gone to high school, right? They may not have gone to law school. They may have all the evidence of what happened to them back home because they had to flee for their lives. So it's pretty crazy. There's, issues with interpretation.
Okay, let's talk about that. Some of the, let's say, you have a caseload of, I don't know, then you have all of these different types, all of these different, things that you have to put together. How does that work? Do you have an admin assistant yourself to help you with
I
that?
never have. So I've worked in nonprofits my whole career. And here's the thing, it's this area where there's such a high need and such little resources, right? Because like I said, there's no public defender system. There's no government funding for all. There is now for like a couple small groups, some government funding for counsel, but most people don't. So if you are representing people, it's like a Hail Mary. I mean, most of the time you don't have a legal assistant. Private attorneys might, but most of the private attorneys are like, small 1, 2, 3 attorney shops, right? And they may have one legal assistant, if any. So it's a lot of doing the filings, right? And tabbing the pages and having to highlight all the exhibits and all of that. It's a lot. I mean, I feel very grateful I'm not doing the trial work anymore. I do more like management and supervision, which has helped a lot with work-life balance and having kids and all of that. But it's rough work, and my colleagues who do it are just absolute heroes. They really are.
That brings up a good point. So for somebody who is learning more about this position, what would be, is it Monday through Friday? Is it 8 hours a day? What can they expect there?
Totally depends where you work. I would say like that's a big thing to ask about in interviews. A lot of nonprofits that are doing this work are under-resourced, and there's kind of a burnout culture. So you want to be really smart if you're thinking about going to this career, to really look for an organization that cares about its staff and doesn't expect you to work overtime, right? That's not the norm. I think some organizations are getting smarter about that, especially with like what people have gone through with the pandemic, and more awareness around like the equity implications of that, right? So, and then the private firms, I've never worked in one, but I've heard they work all the time, and it's just insane. And that's true. We know with like big law firms in any area of law, they work like 80-hour weeks, right? But I think it's still a lot, even for these small private immigration firms.
So if a client represents themselves, doesn't speak the language, doesn't know the lingo or the laws or anything like that, they're pretty much what?
I mean, there's studies showing people can be 10 times more likely to win their case if they have a lawyer. So it just makes a huge difference, and it's a lot harder to win if you are unrepresented. People can right? And there's what a lot of these nonprofits do is provide what's called pro se support, where they may not be able to provide representation, but that's a role that a lot of immigration attorneys and nonprofits play, where they're kind of almost coaching or guiding people to represent themselves and helping them understand how their story fits into a legal claim, how they could best put that forward, helping them gather, country conditions evidence. So I know I've been making the field look pretty dark, and it can be, right? But to transition to maybe why someone might want to think about this, like you can make such a huge impact by just being there for and helping people, even if it's helping them put their cases forward by themselves or doing representation. I mean, I can't think of honestly more impactful work in some ways than just being a lawyer and providing counsel to people who otherwise would be alone and be 10 times less likely to win, right? You literally save lives, right? That's why this work can be so rewarding. It's important to have like the work-life balance and do it in the right way and all that.
I'm glad that you did bring up both sides, but I did want to hear about some of the stuff that's kind of a peek behind the curtain, because that's what I like to do here, is find out, well, I'll put it this way. I've talked to people in so many different careers who was like, I had no idea it'd be like this.
I see,
but they're already there, and so this is such a good example of, the both sides of it. I'd like to ask you now, is there anything that sticks out in your mind that was so impactful, like a certain client or a case or something that you'd like to share quickly before we get on to some other items here?
Yeah, I can tell you about one of my favorite clients. So inspiring.
If you're looking to advance your career or learn new skills, then check out our range of online tech classes offered by The Moving Teacher. Visit us soon at themovingteacher.com.
So this is someone who was a green card holder. So a lot of people don't know green card holders can be deported. It can happen. The most common way is by getting a criminal conviction that triggers deportation. And so he got like a relatively minor misdemeanor. And even misdemeanors that caused him to be detained and facing deportation. And it was really quite a tragic situation. He has like 4 U.S. citizen children, and a lot of times what happens in this situation is the family, can get evicted and have just like terrible circumstances when the breadwinner, the caretaker, is detained. So it was really, really hard. And he had a really difficult case that I think most lawyers would have told him not to try because there's no chance. And I was willing to try it for him. And we fought his case up and down on appeal for probably 3 years. And I got him out of detention during that. And then he was actually re-detained because he and his partner were having, a lot of fights and challenges with all the stress of all that, the financial stress and integrating him back in the community. And they both became abusive to each other, and he got a protective order from the state court. And he was like going to work one day, and his kids, he saw them coming off the school bus, and they started running toward him. And he said to me, how could I not hug my daughters, right? But he wasn't supposed to go near them or touch them. So his partner called the police, he was re-detained. And that was the only, so a bond hearing is when you're trying to get someone out of detention, you're arguing before an immigration judge, they should be released. That was the only hearing where I cried in court. And I'll never forget, my supervisor was like, you do not cry in court. But it was just so moving how much this man cared about his children and being home with them. And they were really suffering when he was detained, right? Like they were having health issues, they were failing in school, and they just started thriving when he was back home. And I found out during this that he had this really tragic childhood. I won't go into detail, but some really terrible things happened to him. And it turned out we didn't know for the first 3 years, but he actually had a very strong asylum case. And that ended up being, at the end of the day, how we won his case and kept him in the US, because the arguments to keep his green card, I had enough arguments I made creative to like keep fighting and keep him in the country for years. But eventually the courts just rejected them, which happens a lot.
Explain really quickly what an asylum case is.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So asylum is a type of relief someone can apply for in immigration court. It actually comes from an international convention, the Refugee Convention, that was created after the Holocaust and what happened to Jewish refugees, as a way the international community wanted to create a system to provide protection for people after that happened, because there was no system. And what was created is if someone could establish they were facing persecution or feared persecution based on one of 5 protected grounds: race, religion, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. I'm always forgetting the 5th one. I'll remember it later. But if you can establish in one of those, then you can make a claim for asylum and get protection in the US or in another country. So this is actually the main way people are able to fight a case of deportation in immigration court, because we have signed an international convention obligating us to give people protection who meet those legal requirements. That being said, it's extremely difficult to meet all of the legal requirements of that claim. It's very, very difficult, hotly litigated on every single issue. And, it's a very political issue, right? Immigration is political. So there's a lot of that going on in the law.
Shifting gears a little bit. What type of people would you say, personality-wise, background-wise, as far as education, would do good in this position?
Oh, good question. Well, I'll tell you what we really need in the field. We really need Spanish speakers. There is a very low amount of Spanish speakers who are immigration attorneys. And, the largest group of immigrants in the US come from Spanish-speaking countries, right? The highest populations. And also many asylum seekers today are coming from places like Central America, right, where they speak Spanish. So in order to provide like the most client-centered representation, we need people who can speak their language, right? And there's just not a lot of lawyers who speak Spanish who go into immigration. So I would say if you're interested at all and you speak Spanish or willing to learn Spanish, there is a need for your help. Right. And then to answer your question, I mean, I think what I've seen a lot of people attracted to immigration law, and what attracted me is, having that combination of really caring about social justice and people, right, and fighting for people's rights, plus an interest in other cultures or languages or traveling international. It's really that combination of those two things. So, anyone who's interested in those areas, or international human rights, immigration law is a fantastic career to go into. And there's a lot of jobs in it. There really are quite a lot of jobs because the need is so high. We are actually having trouble hiring. We have for a long time, because the need and the number of jobs are much higher than the availability of attorneys in this area.
Are there a lot of interpreters employed by immigration lawyers?
There is, mostly by the court, by the immigration court. They hire interpreters constantly because they have to. For the immigration lawyers, they tend to not have the resources to like hire an interpreter unless it's kind of like a rare language, but I would say most try to have at least someone on staff who speaks Spanish, or use like a language line where you can kind of on demand get an interpreter.
So if someone wanted to move more in the direction of immigration law as a student, what advice would you give them for getting into this career path? College or even mid-level career changes? Anybody really?
Yeah, I would say to get your feet wet and intern somewhere if you can, right? To get a feel for what the field is like, what the work is like, because it's very specific work and it's not for everyone. especially detained work. It's really not for everyone. And if you can take a class on it at your university if you're studying. If they have one, that would be amazing. If not, like go to the library and check out some books on immigration law. Or there's actually many podcasts now that talk about immigration law, and just get to know what people are talking about. And I think people can tell pretty quickly if they're interested in that or not. It's usually like you're really interested or you're really not, right? And I appreciate, people reach out to me all the time to like ask about my career and what it's like. So I would encourage other people to reach out to others, immigration attorneys they can find, and just pick their brain, hear about their experience, and see what path they've taken.
How can people reach you to ask you any questions about this?
Yeah, please do feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to give advice. The best way to reach me is on Instagram at Adina Applebaum, AdinaApplebaum.
Dina, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure learning more about you and about immigration law. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me and for your interest. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. If you have a job you want to learn more about, let me know and I'll create an episode for you. Contact me at hello@workuniversity.org. You can also get new episode announcements when you follow me on Instagram at work.university.